Welcome to the MUS181 Final Exam Review. We're first going to begin with the three major record labels. At this time, the three major record labels are Universal Music Group, Sony Music Entertainment, and Warner Music Group. The most important thing to remember is that each of these owns several hundred sub-labels. In those sub-label entities, they all report to and respond to the three majors. The difference between a major record label and an indie label is the association to one of the three majors. So any sub-label that exists is considered a major label as long as it's a part of the three majors. But if you were to create a record label of your own, as long as it's not attached to one of the three majors, it is considered an indie record label. Now let's talk about Paola. Paola is actually a pretty simple process. It was a legal method early in the 60s and became an illegal process eventually, where someone from the record label could literally just pay a radio station to play or spin the artist's music. And it became an illegal practice because of the fact that it created a monopoly for the record labels who had the money to spend or to pay those radio stations versus any other either smaller labels or indie artist would essentially be cut off from that. As a result, though, without Paola in place or as a practice, we technically still have a method of pay to play that still exists if you kind of follow the money trail, and that is essentially radio promotions. So if you wanted to land yourself on a major radio station with your music and have it spun or played, what would have to happen is that you'd have to actually hire a radio promoter, someone who already has a direct network and contact with the radio station to be able to plug that music and bring that music to the radio station. Since that costs money, essentially you're still paying to play or paying to be spun on radio, which essentially just means that Paola still exists. It just, instead of paying the radio station, you're actually paying a third-party aggregate. Moving on to traditional recording agreements versus the 360 recording agreements. In a traditional recording agreement, you're going to see obviously the main focal point being the recording. And some of the assets that still carry on with the recording could possibly be things like the use of the artist's image in lots of different ways. And it still may include things like gaining access towards sponsorships. And though it actually has a wing or a division in the contract that may exist or center around shares of live performance revenue, it doesn't focus on how much is really going to be plugged in or pushed in terms of that regard. In any recording agreement, one of the big questions always ends up being, well, how much money is being spent in marketing and things like that. The traditional has a very focused approach to the marketing push, and it only essentially is to push and promote the recording and possibly some sort of video that would go with it. And that's what makes it different from the 360. In a 360, there's a more holistic approach, and values of the offerings on the contract actually are dispersed between lots of different categories, which may include merchandising in any way, shape, or form. If an artist had some sort of YouTube presence or some sort of video presence, a great example would be Kelly Pickler. She is a TV star as well as a recording artist, and so having a 360 deal with an artist or a personality like that would also encompass all of the other aspects, personal appearances and things like that. But the bigger thing is that the 360 recording agreement actually entails or outlines direct dollars and percentage breakdowns for who is earning what in each category, where the traditional really is a more condensed version, and it doesn't really offer those other possibilities. Which in truth, the sad part about that is again, when you're signing contracts, you're kind of, as an artist, or when an artist is signing contracts, they're showing sheer potential, and they may have tracking numbers or some sort of track record of numbers, but moving forward into a new style of project in alignment with a record label still means that there's no guarantee on what will happen in the end. In a traditional recording agreement, because you're signing on to very limited things, while the risk may be lower for the artist, what it also does is it means that if the targeted revenue or projections that the record label had proposed when they were brought on the artist for the recording agreement are not met, then they might not be super interested in funding the other elements that they would have maybe signed on if they had initially done it as a 360, which is the argument for why traditional agreements still exist, where some labels just kind of like to get their feet wet and try some things, and just see whether or not an artist has any pull. And then if they don't, they just essentially are no longer obligated to do much further based upon the agreement. Let's talk about producer points. Producers essentially are the brainchild of the overall operations of a recording. In some stages, the producers are kind of more of a lame duck, and on other ends of the spectrum, the producer might be the only driving factor that's actually making the album move. Anywhere in between is usually where most producers sit. So a producer not only essentially develops the artist, prepares them for recording, helps them choose their music, maybe even finding songwriters. They also do a lot of the logistical elements like booking the musicians, booking the studios, finding the right mix engineer, mastering engineer, basically bringing life to the album in any way, shape, or form. And they, in some ways, they have to make elections as to whether the artist is ready, whether they may need other musicians to kind of come in and support. So like maybe an artist also plays a secondary instrument, but it's not strong enough to really make the record pop. So they'll bring in other people. Well, with that, the producers are contracted based upon particular point values, and the point values are really important because the point values sound like, I don't know, it just sounds like a game. Yeah, I'm earning a producer's point, and I've been in the studio a lot of times where someone just kind of just throws that out there. Okay, you get a point on the album for whatever reason. Unfortunately, if it's not in some sort of contract form, it doesn't really exist, or even if it was just in an email as some sort of kind of a note or a splits memo. If it wasn't in those kinds of forms, obviously it doesn't count. But when it's contracted, the important part is that though it may say producer point, it really only represents a singular percentage of the overall breakdown from the recording revenue. And the big key there is like, where does the producer's point get broken off from revenue? And essentially where that takes place is after, like if you're signed with a record label, after the record label recoups whatever it spent, producers' points are then brought on from that number that's left over. The other thing is a lot of times producers aren't paid from their points directly, or should I say immediately. They're usually responsible for like whatever they were paid as a producer with their upfront fee. So producers receive some sort of lump sum fee to be a producer. Whatever that number is actually is deducted as an expense against their percentage. And then only after that percentage is earned, or after that lump sum is earned, then their percentage starts to come out to them. The important part is it's a 1% per point. Most producers can make anywhere between 2 and 4 points. Some producers make 20 points. It just depends on what the deal is. In the modern age, there's not really a set in stone variation of that. I think it's usually whatever the artist or the label is willing to give up to the producer and the value that they may see in the producer's work. The big thing on that is that the percentage is from both mechanical, point of sale, and performance royalties. And so they come from both of those royalty categories as a singular percentage. Or I'm sorry, it's a single percent per point. So like, let's say it's a 4 point. So they'll get 4 points of that overall share. But just remember that that's after expenses. So like when a lot of people ask me like, should I become a producer? Is it lucrative to be a producer? I think the answer is yes. But you have to really focus and target the front end fee as a means of survival. And then kind of look at the back end percentage as more of that's the icing on the cake, because in truth, that percentage point will not come until, like most situations, where it won't come until 90 days after the close of the quarter. But it may actually not really generate that much money in that time frame, depending on how big the promotions and marketing are for it. The recording production process is very simple. I think it's important to kind of look at the process as an overall, like, how do we best prepare the artist to go into the studio? And I think that's one of those things that, like, in the recording process, it's kind of overlooked. Step one, number one, are the songs ready? Are the musicians ready? Is the music ready? Is everybody actually ready, rehearsed, ready to perform? It's possible to take an artist into the studio over the course of a week or a weekend even, and come out with final product in terms of their actual recording quality and their overall technique. If everybody's prepped, everybody's ready, if you can record things like the rhythm section as a group instead of having to do them separately. It just depends on what production looks like. If there's a lot of time that needs to be spent thinking things through in the studio, that obviously limits or hinders the ability to move quickly. A lot of recording artists, though, once they have enough budget and enough money, the record label will literally just rather put them in the studio for 3 months and let them work it all out, knowing that, like, in the end, they pretty much have to have a really good final product because they spent so much time. And there's not really that as many limitations on the budget that's spent. But the budget expectation really is, and the most important part about the recording production is the budget expectation of recording is that it must be expensed from the revenue that the artist receives before the artist then gets their breakdown from the label. So, and if you were an indie artist, of course, you'd be doing the same thing. If you were an indie artist and you shelled out your own money and expense to record an album, of course, it's being deducted from the amount of money that you really make when you make it back, because you're really not making anything back until you recoup the expenses that you spent. So in reality, like when you're looking at the budget for recording, I oftentimes like to just kind of weigh out the percentage or risk based upon what the expectation is in sales. So like if you were looking at it going, well, should I spend $1,000 on a single to be in the studio to record it, to get it mixed and mastered? And like, how do I weigh out whether I should be doing that? Part of the answer is really like, what is your expected gross revenue? What's your expected net earning? And are you splitting it with anybody? You know, is there a way to offset that cost by having other people assist? Now that obviously gets a little tricky, but I think that's kind of where you weigh out. So like, where is your music going to be going is part of like the real question. I want to talk about red flags for management agreements. Management agreements, we went through many clauses in the management agreements, and then there were some things that were super important. But I think the red flags and the things that have to be highlighted in the most important things that I always find are, what is the compensation package? Is it favorable? Compensation packages for managers really should be around 15%. Any higher just does not leave enough wiggle room for the artist, especially if the artists are splitting those percentage fees. If there's multiple artists involved, meaning like it's a band of 4 people, that's obviously a lot to split. But if you were to just take 15, like let's just say that a manager came in and said, oh, I want 20%, and you're a band of, let's say, 4 people. Okay, so we have a band of 4 people, and we're looking at 100% without a label touching it, without anybody else in the mix. At 100%, if the producer is going to take 20%, you realize that between 4 people, the other 4 essentially would then take 20% as well. And then you have to ask the question, should the manager be making the exact amount of money as a single member of the group? And then as soon as a label comes in and decides that they want to take 50% of earnings, okay, so this is the real kicker. When a label comes in and takes 50% of earnings and the manager is still taking 20% of earnings, if you do the math, you'll have 30% left, which means if you still had a band of 4, then everybody's making less than 10%. That obviously is a major issue, because then you look at the manager and go, wow, they're making more than twice as much as a single member of the group. That's when it becomes a problem. So realistically, you're trying to maintain 15%. You'd love it if you could do less, but obviously there's an incentive if you kind of keep it level. The 3 other elements that are super important is, how long is the term? Like, how long are we going to be with them to be able to evaluate whether or not we still like them? What does the termination clause say about what happens if we get rid of them? A lot of them have a parachute clause, essentially, that allows them to, in the termination process, still make earnings while not doing anything for the artist anymore. And then how the expenses, with the expense categories, like who's paying the expenses, who approves the expenses, what is the threshold for the expenses, so like if you gave a manager a la carte on expenses, meaning you just said, hey, we're going to sign you over power of attorney, which is done a lot of times in a management contract, but you don't outline some sort of limitation for expenses or some sort of approval process by the artist, technically the manager could spend as much money as they really had access to and just say, oh, well, it's all expendable, or like we can expense it, instead of being really nitpicky about what's being spent, which means that, like, if they're traveling or they're making deals for you, instead of, being somewhat limited or modest, they're going to get themselves, just like blown out suites at fancy hotels, and be spending money on dinner and travel and all that kind of stuff. So it's very important, because it is what gets broken down, even pulled out of what the artist makes, in addition to the compensation percentage. With red flags for recording agreements, and we talked a little bit about the recording agreements, but the biggest red flags for recording agreements tend to be things like net profits. Like, where do the profits get split, and how do the profits get approved? And like, at what category are we giving? Like, at what level is the label taking their percentage, and then how's everybody else getting their percentages from there? And then what's left really for the artist? I think the most important part about that is, when you're talking about your recording agreement, there should be some sort of outline addendum, or inside of the contract, some sort of outline spreadsheet that just says, hey, like, if you sell this many units, this is what, by the time all the royalties come back through, when you look at the what you're going to make on the PRO from what the label's going to pay you, every avenue of revenue that they're really considering, it should give you a proposed value of what you'll make. So you, as an artist, you could literally look at it and go, okay, so the contract says I'm making 50%, but what does that really mean in real dollars? If I look at how many units I could propose to sell, like, what am I actually going to make as a dollar figure? And then that kind of brings us to just some basic red flags, things like cross-collateralization, remembering that cross-collateralization is the ability for the label to basically recoup on what they consider a loan to the artist to make a recording. And they can recoup from one recording to the next. So if one recording is successful, but the next recording is not, they essentially can go back and expect the artist to pay back the amount of money that is due them based upon that expense, and sometimes even the projection that they made. I think one of the biggest things that most people forget about is, since this is an active and it's a live business, that there are people sitting around in an office not just going, well, this would be cool if we break even. Instead, they're literally going, well, this is what we project to make off of this artist. So it hurts the record label if they fall short of those projections, because they're basing like their business decisions, their financial outlook, and meetings that they have with their board and their shareholders based upon those financial projections. So when they're not met, they also kind of count against the artist. And that's where cross-collateralization can not only get involved yet again, but like it further rolls into, like, if an artist, and this is the worst part of the whole cross-collateralization process, if an artist did really well on a first album and then they did poorly on a second album, and then we take their money away from them, and we're still signed on to do a third album, what's the incentive of the artist to even do a third album? And like, it kind of takes out a lot of the fluff, like a lot of the opportunities for the artist to be super excited about the album, and instead they're just trying to get an album done and walk away so they can be free and clear. And sometimes, unfortunately, it just kind of moves to litigation instead of finalizing or completing a contract. And I'd be very interested to see, like, what is the percentage if like you actually looked at label by label, like in the same way you look at a university and when they go, what is the rate of completion and the retention rate for students. I wonder what the retention rate really is for artists at label by label, and the completion rate of actually fulfilling contracts. In addition to that, though, mechanical royalties. The big thing with mechanical royalties is that the mechanical royalty should not ever really be seen as an expense by the label. So what the label sometimes will say is, like, they'll put the mechanical royalty, which is due the artist and the songwriter, they'll put it in as an expense category, so that what they'll do is they'll give that fee to the artist, but then they'll on the expense side expense it or deduct it from the total percentage that's then given. So if you had a 50-50 deal with a label, and then you were also receiving the mechanical royalty, the 9.1 cents per song royalty mechanically from the sales of your music, let's say that the mechanical royalty, that 9.1 cents per song, totaled up to $20,000. Well, they essentially, if they apply mechanical royalties as an expense, they would take that $20,000. They would look at the overall revenue. They would deduct it from the overall revenue. Let's say they made $100,000 on the album. They'd take that 20 out, and they take the 80 and split that 50-50, which essentially takes away $10,000 from the artist. So like it's important where the mechanical royalty is placed, and important that it's not listed as an expense, as one of the expense items. It's very easy to overlook that because it can just be slipped into the expense clause, but that's something to look for. One other thing is controlled composition. Controlled composition is the idea that instead of giving you the mechanical royalty rate, we're going to give you a percentage of the mechanical royalty rate to allow the label or the artist, because sometimes the artist isn't a songwriter, so sometimes they're not due the mechanical royalty percentage. It allows them to essentially create a threshold for that. So they may say, hey, by signing this contract, even though the statutory rate is 9.1 cents a song that's sold, we're going to sign you on for 75% of the actual composition, rate, or the statutory rate as a controlled composition. Ideally, it's to withhold some of that funding so that they have more money to either pay the artist or to pay the label. And in some instances, they try to offset that percentage and then say, well, the rest of the remaining percentage will be paid to the label. And so those are kind of key, elements to look for. In the same way we're looking at management contracts, we want written approvals for costs. We want some sort of written approval or some sort of agreement made for costs. And then lastly, the multi-album deal. Multi-album deals seem like a good thing in the beginning or the onset, but that's again where cross-collateralization comes into play. Also, multi-album deals don't really allow for flexibility of an increase or a surge in either marketing dollars or expenses for production. So like if you sign a multi-album deal and let's say it was $1 million deal, well, it may sound like a lot of money, but if in real life the record label is only putting $1 million into a 5-album deal, when you split all that out, there's very little money left for recording. And then, where's the money for marketing going to come? So it's one of those things where a lot of times it's kind of important to like look at how many albums are supposed to be fulfilled in that, and leaving some sort of room or flexibility for renegotiation and moving on to the next album. Going to EPKs, we talked a little bit about EPKs. We didn't really get to talk as much as I would have preferred. I think the electronic press kit, super important. Keys to just consider: what platforms are you using? In an EPK, easiest one, I think the best and easiest one is to just use a basic website. You can do it in a lot of different formats, and there's a lot of different website builders that you could use for free. And then just go buy your URL from like GoDaddy for like $15 a year, and it would be yourname.com. Attach it to your website, away you go. But the big thing with the EPK is you have to look at who's your audience, and should you pay for your EPK site? The reason I bring that up is because Sonic Bids is like a massive EPK engine, but it requires their artists to pay for lots of different things. One of those is being on there on the pro level, which means like if you're not really on there on the pro level, you're really not being seen anyway. Secondly, they require you to pay to submit to shows and performances and things like that. Well, I think you just kind of have to look at that and take it in your own like way and just make it an election. Like, am I at the level where I should be paying to promote myself in that vein? Or is there other ways that I could spend my money that would better promote myself? I think, almost immediately, like if, let's just say that you were going to go do the Sonic Bids route. If you're going to end up spending a couple $100s a year, you might as well have hired a photographer to get your photos done professionally. And if expenses even included anything more than that, you might as well jump into the studio and cut a real single somewhere at a real studio, and then have a photographer come in and do all the imagery for that, taking photos and all that. Just throw that on realistically, throw that on Instagram. Essentially, you'd have a better EPK push or draw just from the visibility that it would generate. Big thing there is just understanding like what your audience is wanting to see or what your audience is wanting to hear. I think I'm absolutely guilty of this. Like sometimes on my EPK, I like putting stuff that really gets me excited, but it may not be the most applicable to my audience. So you kind of have to weigh that out and share it with people. Ask them what they think. If they're like, this sucks, just ask them why. It's a hard question. It's a hard conversation to have, but it's kind of one of those things where it's kind of easier to know that now than to go sharing it with the world and spend 5 years trying to promote yourself and your EPK and never realize why there's a deficiency or an issue. Looking at who pays the following to the artist. These are actually fairly interesting and easy ones to look at. Okay, and the reason I look at this is we kind of have to reverse engineer the process. Like there's all these departments and isolated components of the music industry, but if I'm an artist, I don't care a whole lot about that when I'm really just chasing dollars. And so like the big key is knowing where that money's supposed to come from, and then looking at like, okay, well, how do I better or more fluidly create like an engine where like I can connect to my dollars quickly. So radio royalties come from the PRO. So that's why you should be signed up with either BMI or ASCAP. Those are easy things to do. You sign up with your PRO. It is a little bit of a process, but it sticks with you for life. Get it done. If you haven't done it, if you're going to sell anything, go get it done. Obviously, you could also, if you're going to be a union musician, yeah, get on with your union, because they're going to be the ones to pay you those rates, your union rates. They're going to, you're going to get your retirement plans and all that kind of stuff, your pension, that's all going to be wrapped up into that. So yeah, do it that way. Mechanical royalties, though, like when we look at mechanicals are specifically paid from the label, but they also come from another interesting kind of location for mechanical royalties. So mechanical royalties can also come from sound exchange if they're sold digitally, and like if your songs are sold digitally, and if there's some sort of digital a licensing agreement made somewhere. So like a great example is like if your music's on satellite radio or even just internet radio. A lot of the internet radio stations have a direct deal with Sound Exchange. They pay their fees instead of the PROs. They send them to Sound Exchange, and Sound Exchange is the direct distributor to the artist. In addition to that, though, like mechanicals will oftentimes be licenses will actually be paid to the Harry Fox agency, and those ones will either be paid directly to the label, if there is a label, or directly to the artist, depending on who's signed up with HFA, Harry Fox agency. TV royalties, though, again, those will come through PRO. So it's kind of important to kind of like, there's going to be multiple levels. Like there's all these places, and the good part in music industry, there's all these places for revenue and income to stream in. Bad part is someone has to manage all those places and make sure all those places actually send the money directly to the artist or to the label, and then divvy up those percentages based upon whatever agreements exist. That's where essentially an admin team really comes in. And what you get with a record label oftentimes is when you get a recording agreement, there's usually either an admin component inside of the label, or they'll offset that admin to the publishing team. So the publishing team will handle all of the back-end admin. And that's usually because they'll be with the life of the music, where the label may have like a 5-year stay. The publisher may be a lifetime deal. So how long does it take for a PRO to pay the artist? And that's just an easy one. We often just consider it 90 days past the close of the quarter. If you go onto BMI or ASCAP, you'll see that they actually specifically state that on their websites about payment. But the bigger part about that is that like if you were on a label, yes, expect a ton of money to come in 90 days after the close of the quarter, because they probably promoted and got your first day of sales really, really well. If you're an indie artist, realistically, that 90 days past the close of that first quarter is probably a small number. It's probably just like you getting your first job somewhere where you're just kind of ramping up on that first paycheck. Maybe you put in 8 hours. It doesn't have anything to write home about. But you're really looking for like the surges that follow. So the big thing is if you're an indie artist, you're not holding out for PRO payments. You would know it if you needed. You would know it if you were really expecting them. If you're all over the radio, like all over the radio, then yeah, PRO payments are going to be big. If you're not really hearing yourself on the radio, or you're not, in a store hearing your music on the radio, it's more likely that what's going to come through on PRO is going to be something, but it's not going to be enough to really, help you. So you got to be banking your dollars on things like performance or direct sponsorship deals. Let's talk about some music business roles. Some of the music business roles that are super important, of course, the PRO, so the Performing Rights Organizations, ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC, which is essentially an invite-only group. Then, of course, we have managers, and they break down to artist managers, business managers, tour managers. The artist manager, essentially the real difference is the artist manager manages the artist. The business manager really counts the money, handles the accounting a lot of times, taxes and all that. Tour manager handles all the road logistics. Most people kind of get confused with an artist manager and a tour manager, kind of forgetting that someone literally has to book the flights, someone has to, lease the bus, someone has to manage the route. All the ins and outs, food, flights, all those logistics have to be cleared. And boy, if you're going out of the country to multiple countries, that is a massive undertaking. But that's kind of exactly why they exist. And each one of those can have a team or a full office. Producers obviously work with the artist, produce the music. That one we've talked about already. Publicists, though, which I categorized this one in terms of like publicists along with radio promoters, because from a music standpoint, like you even though you could have a public relations or a PR type of publicist, your biggest publicity is always going to come through radio, because that's the big thing. Is like I always tell people, it's like if you could be famous on social media or you could be famous on radio, go to radio, because social media follows. Like radio is like broadcast, like no matter what. Like I don't know if you've ever been somewhere and you're like, boy, I hate this song, but I can't turn it off because it's on the radio. And maybe you're walking through the mall, or you're just essentially it's being broadcast. Like whether you like it or not, it's being pushed and promoted, because that it's being pushed and promoted from radio. Then essentially anybody who either never heard it before can hear it, or anybody who is super excited about it can hear it more. But in terms of like how that really connects to things like social media and all the other marketing campaigns, it's like once we go to radio, all of a sudden we have something to talk about. So even like media has something to talk about. Oh, they're on the radio, or you could hear them on here. I mean, like a lot of times like media outlets are looking for ways to point to something to make their story fly. And because in truth, like it'd be better if, from a publicist standpoint, they always want to tell a story. It'd be better if like you were a one-legged, one-eyed artist who somehow managed to play both a piano and a drum set and a flute all at the same time. But because every artist's story is not that, or every artist's story isn't about like how they came from nothing and then now they're something. In truth, a lot of the artist stories, like if you go look at a lot of the major artists that are out there, they were just like sons or daughters of actors. They were already rich before they ever started making music. And that's not much of a story to tell. So of course, what they do instead of doing that is push and promote it to radio and let the radio be the surging driving factor for why people want to talk about it. So it's kind of interesting ploy, essentially. A couple more publishing companies, the publishing wing, where the label was essentially more the bank or the money. Publishing handles all the raw duties, things like admin, promoting the music. They're going to push the catalog till the day the artist is dead and beyond, because they own it. If you want to think about like what a publishing company does, go look at like just think about like Elvis. Okay, like a publishing company is still using his music, they're still using his likeness, they're putting him anywhere you could think of. In Hallmark cards, he's still on television. I mean, like any outlet they can possibly think of. Publishing companies are trying to create and promote new avenues. And then of course, if you think of the Beatles, like the Beatles model, okay, so the Beatles, are long gone. I mean, they're around, but obviously, they don't perform together anymore, but they have a Cirque du Soleil show. That's a publishing deal. They have other outlets or television shows, YouTube. I mean, those are all publishing deals. The fact that they just came out with a even more blown out super deluxe version of the White Album yet again is a direct publishing deal. So that's what the publishing companies do. They just sell and sell and resell. Looking at the record label, though, the record label is more like the direct push from right now. So like they're looking at the right now, who's hot right now. We're spending money on making their recordings. We're going to push and promote them. We're going to own their copyrights. And then, of course, we're going to, and the fun word, exploit all of their work so that we make more sales and more revenue. So the record company really comes in with the heavy hitting budget, and then they hand off or make deals directly with the publishing companies to kind of facilitate that roundabout full picture. We're almost through this. The Harry Fox Agency, I think we kind of blew through that a little fast, but essentially the Harry Fox Agency is like a one-stop shop to grant mechanical licenses. So like if I want to cover a song, I can just go onto the Harry Fox Agency website, go in through their little song agency group, pick out what song I want to cover, and then pay a royalty fee directly based upon how many units I plan to sell. And essentially that's kind of what they do. They really facilitate like this driving factor of like, okay, well, people want to use music that's already been out there or licensed music, and they don't want to always have to contact the direct publisher, nor does the direct publisher always want to have to be involved in like let's say there's a million little kids that just want to make their own, Moana soundtrack videos on YouTube. It's too much to have to track all those individual points. So instead, they just create a deal with Harry Fox Agency, who actually works with providers like YouTube and Facebook and Vimeo to generate the royalties that are necessary to actually pay the artists and songwriters, publishers, and labels who essentially earn those revenues from those songs directly. I shouldn't really have to explain much about who the artist is. I should just say that most really successful artists realize that they have to be a singular element, or they have to find themselves inside of who they are. Their identity is kind of hand in hand with what they can do. So like if I'm an artist that sings, that's my identity. But if I'm an artist that sings and plays the piano, that's my identity. But a lot of artists kind of go into the studio and begin to realize as they're going through their development process with a record label that they really have to choose like what that avenue looks like. They can't necessarily just be the artist who plays piano and plays guitar and plays the drums and does all that, because it's way too broad to promote or market. And like try to say it in a sentence, if you were to say like, let's just say national recording artist, musician, singer-songwriter, recording artist, like you try to put that in a sentence or in a PR buzz statement, it doesn't work. So a lot of times they just kind of want a singular way to kind of categorize you so that the promotion and marketing is super clean and easy. From a songwriter, going into the songwriter realm, technically, I'll just be real. Anybody could be a songwriter. I think when you cross over into actually being a legitimate songwriter is really when you're making direct deals either with artists, you're making direct deals with labels or with publishing companies or distribution. And then, of course, as a songwriter, getting on your PRO, being set up with all those other royalty payment outlets, connecting with essentially like all of those avenues so that your revenue streams are set up and ready to pour in while you just sit around and write. And it's kind of one of those things where like it's tough to be a writer if you're not super acceptable to like the criticism, because you get it from everybody. And in truth, even like really successful songs are heavily criticized. They're probably even more heavily criticized because they're so much more visible. So part of it is just really honing in on your craft and continuing the work, which leads us to probably the most beaten down of all of the realms inside of these is really oftentimes the composers, because the composers are doing the same thing the songwriters are doing, although most of them had to get master's degrees to just kind of get to where they are as a composer. And then unfortunately, furthermore, they're hired on either with film or television, and then they have to undergo this whole process of just going under constant scrutiny about this or that based upon what the clients want or what the television show or movie wants or what the directors are wanting to deliver. So that's a really tough job, although it's very lucrative. Unfortunately, the one thing that songwriters get that composers often don't is songwriters get to maintain ownership of their rights in a lot of ways, and they may even share publishing with the publisher as they sign off their rights. So maybe they do sign off their rights to the label, but they can still jointly own the publishing. Composers almost immediately, as soon as the deal is made, they lose any and all rights or even additional compensation splits on the back end from their work. So like the directors and the film houses or the television shows will directly own them, and then they can exploit them in whatever way they see fit. Now, obviously, the composers get a big chunk of cash in the front end, but the other downside to that is a lot of times, like if it's they call it an all-in deal with a composer, they'll pay him $200,000, but the all-in deal is that we're giving you $200,000 to compose works for our television show, so you are then responsible to take that $200,000, book the studio, hire the musicians, work the talent, get all the recordings, get it mixed, get it mastered and delivered. So like the all-in deal with composers oftentimes means that budget is actually set aside to spend on the making of the music product, and then whatever's left is what the composer gets to keep. So, which is a tough line to ride, because you're always going to want to pour more money in it to make it sound better, but then obviously you have to make something out of it financially, so you have to reserve something for yourself. Looking at general terms, we already talked about PROs, performing rights organizations, the 360 deal. We did talk about this in class, but we didn't talk about this already, about fair use and first use. Fair use is a clause that basically says that like you can use certain copywritten material for different things. Some of that includes things like, education or just sharing like in the comfort of your home. If you go on YouTube, YouTube has a very neatly organized fair use policy for how YouTubers get to use copywritten content. And so as long as like it falls under either parody, it falls under some sort of commentary, meaning like someone's like either doing like a news broadcast about it or something, stuff like that. It essentially falls into the fair use category and is not necessarily blocked for copyright purposes. And even though it may automatically be on a YouTube engine, you can actually technically file to have it corrected so that you can use your fair use or enact your fair use. But it's often confused with the clause that follows here, the first use, which first use basically just means that whoever the copyright owner is of a piece of content is the person who has the right to first publish their work. So that means that like if I was in a studio and I had a bunch of friends with me and they all heard my new music and one of them decided they wanted to just go cut their own cover version of it and release it to the world, technically it would be an illegal act because I, as the copyright holder, have the right to do it first. But the second element about that is if I sign my rights over to a record label and I wrote the song, record label owning the rights, owning the copyrights, have first use. So it's important that I can cover the song and I can play it on YouTube or release it on, kind of in that kind of it means contractually. I'm sure in my contract that I signed with the record label basically probably says that I'm not allowed to release it myself to distributors, but it does allow for whoever the actual copyright holder is to take first use. So that would not be me in that particular situation. Looking at publisher-songwriter splits, I oftentimes talk about like what's the split percentage, like what do the split percentages really mean, like how do they work? When we're looking at the publisher-songwriter splits, one of the things we have to look at is like what was the agreement made? Like oftentimes a publisher and a songwriter can just literally split it 50-50. And the big thing with that is it's all about where that split takes place. Does that split take place on actual sales? Is it part of the mechanical royalty? Is it part of the performance royalty, which gets paid by the PRO? So it's as long as that's outlined, and it can be outlined in a lot of different ways. As long as it's outlined and it's clear, then that kind of denotes or dictates how the publisher-songwriters split out their earnings. But it's important that like songwriters always stay in the loop on those percentage splits. Co-publishing versus sub-publishing. The biggest thing here is it's very important to know. The reason why this is so important is because it goes down to percentage breakdowns. Co-publishing is a split between a pair of publishers or even a group of publishers. Sub-publishing is when a third-party organization kind of has to jump in and handle publishing in a way that the main publisher just can't, that they don't have the capacity to. And often that's why it's specifically for foreign territories. So like you're going to have a sub-publisher in China for your works in America because they have an office in China. They can handle a publishing wing there. They know what to do with it. They know how to sell the work. And then they'll handle all the financial elements there. And the real difference is in a co-publishing deal, co-publishing is usually 50-50. In a sub-publishing deal, that sub-publishing value is placed on like what's being sold or generated from the sub-publisher. So oftentimes it can be a lot less than 50%. It could be like a 25% earning, but it's one of those things where like the sub-publisher is taking in money and then they're going to pay whatever the split is from the sub-publisher to the main publisher. But obviously the main publisher never owes the sub-publisher if they're making art. So like if I am a main publisher in America, I don't owe my sub-publisher in China anything, but they owe me whatever they sell in China. And that's kind of why the routing's a little different. It's not the same as just a direct split. Oh, when we look at copyrights, the first thing we want to look at are the 6 bundled rights. What are the rights given to a copyright owner? They're really simple. The right to reproduce the work, the right to create a derivative of the work, so based on the work, some sort of alteration or remix or build upon the work, to distribute the copies of the work, to publicly display the work and to perform the work, of course, and in the case of the sound recordings, to perform the work publicly by means of some sort of digital audio transmission. So the big thing with those copyright rules and laws are like, though those are the bundled rights, those are the rights that are given to the copyright owner. Anytime anybody wants to do any of those other things that are non-copyright owners, they basically have to attain a license. And licenses are attained in a lot of different ways. So like one of the big things, like most people look at this and go, okay, well, if I'm a copyright owner and I have the right to perform the work, does that mean that like somebody else who doesn't own my copyright does not have the right to perform my work? And technically the answer is yes, or they cannot perform your work unless they're paying a license. Well, that's kind of when we have to turn around to the PROs, and this is where this happens. If I go play a show at the Hard Rock Cafe, well, the Hard Rock actually pays a license to the PRO that gives me the opportunity and authority to play cover music as part of my show, which means I can play stuff that I don't own copyrights to. And technically, the venue is paying the license to be able to do that, to allow artists to do that. And that essentially they're responsible for tracking those songs and then sending them to the PRO. And that's how the artist gets paid from those performances. Although that's a huge gray area because there's a lot of venues that don't really do either a great job at that or they really don't keep a whole lot of track of that. But that's a huge thing. Well, okay, so let's just talk about let's talk about the copyright elements that are important, like the two types of copyrights, because again, they apply to these 6 bundled rights. First of all, the performing arts copyright. Essentially, if I was writing a book, the performing arts element of my book falls under the PA copyright. But if I made an audiobook version of my book, it becomes a sound recording. So then it becomes an SR version of the copyright. So the two types of copyrights are performing arts and sound recordings, PA and SR. And basically, again, that just creates a division between the two. So if I own both rights, that's great. It's possible to own just one set of rights versus another. So like if I wrote a song and I never recorded it, I could technically own the PA rights. And then anybody who decides to record it would essentially own the SR rights. They would still owe me a license fee for using my rights via the PA in order to make the SR. So like we have to have those combined. But that's kind of interestingly enough what allows a lot of different things to take place, like a lot of different elements to take place. And that's one of those things where like if I wrote the song, I own the PA. If someone came in and decided they want me to record my song, that's great. But usually whoever pays for the recording process owns the SR. And that's why the record label typically owns the SR. The record label could then also own the PA, but oftentimes the publishing company comes in and takes the PA. Or they really could just take them jointly if they're in the same group. So like they are two different things and they are two different realms. And those 6 bundled rights essentially break out it 2 times into each of those categories. Lifetime for copyrights essentially is 70 years past the death of the actual copyright creator. So 70 years beyond when they pass. And if the copyrights were picked up by a record label or a publishing company, that term exists 95 years past the death of the copyright owner, the original copyright owner. And so copyright transfers and things like that are super important. A lot of times copyrights fall to the estates, and then the estate has to actually do a direct transfer in order to legitimately own the copyright. It kind of gets sticky once the author dies, and that's why a lot of times you'll see these families kind of go into these legal battles about who owns what. But that's kind of the way that the copyright works. Outside of that, once that copyright lifetime term is done, it falls into public domain, which means anybody can do anything with it. There's no license that's required. Well, it's important to look at who owns a copyright during the following deals. In a recording deal, copyrights are owned by the label or they're owned by the publishing company. In a work for hire, this is key. In a work for hire, copyrights are owned by whoever is paying the work for hire contractor, which means if I'm getting paid as a work for hire to play piano, whoever paid me owns the rights. From a composer's agreement, in a composer's agreement, it's almost the same thing as a work for hire, essentially, because you're going to be paid on the agreement a flat fee to deliver the content that then will be owned by somebody else. So whoever, essentially the director or the film studio that's paying for the music is going to own the rights. In a sync license, though, a sync license is usually generated after the music is created. So whoever owned the music before the sync license was provided is still the owner in the end. So if I wrote a song, I own the rights. Someone wants to use it in a film. They pay me to use it in a film and they license it, but I still get to keep the rights, which means I can license it again based upon whatever terms. They may sign a 2-year deal and say in 2 years you can't license this again. And then after the 2-year period's over, you can license it again as many times as you want. If a record label took the rights, though, and then they did a sync, the record label is the one that owns essentially the rights, although the sync went through somebody else. And then that takes us to the last of the long list here, and most probably the more important, because this is, again, where the money takes place. So we've been talking a lot about licensing because the licensing portions are where the money's made. The mechanical license is a point-of-sale license. Anytime something is sold, there is a mechanical license that is generated. That mechanical license, essentially, the statutory rate is 9.1 cents per song that's purchased. And that includes digital sales and in physical formats. So that is what is essentially due to the songwriter of the work. A compulsory license is essentially using the mechanical license, but what it does is that it essentially is the way that you could license works without ever having to get pre-approval from the publisher. Or even realistically, the Harry Fox agency. You essentially just go make your recording of whatever artists you want. You're just going to pay the full statutory rate directly to them, and it's due within 30 days after the release of the work. And so it's super important with the compulsory that you understand that that's the highest you would ever pay for a license type. That's why a lot of times they're not done, because technically you could direct deal a mechanical license from an artist to lower the mechanical rate, especially if you had bulk. Like if you were going to do bulk sales, you can negotiate those rates. And a lot of times that's done through the Harry Fox agency. Performance licenses are not the license. So it's super important. They're not the license for you to go play the song live. They're the license for the music to be played, period. So that actually includes either live or pre-recorded performances. Again, that's the license a venue has to pay when artists come in and play copywritten works or cover songs. That is the license that radio stations pay when they play people's music 1,000 times. It is a performance license. In any way that the work is either performed live or performed on a pre-recording, it is a performance license. It's short-term, it's non-exclusive. And that takes us to master use. Master use essentially is you're giving it all away, all license types. The master use gives you pretty much all access to all license types. And record labels technically, it's surprising the way that it works out. The record label, they take if you were creating original works, they're going to take your overall rights and your copyrights, and they're going to own them. But at the same time, you still sign a master use license to them for your works. So that gives them the right to do what they need to essentially sell and exploit it. They do make a cable TV license. It's a separate thing, and PROs are paid performance licenses from television. So if you were a normal television station, performance licenses are sent through, the TV royalties are sent through performance licenses. There is a cable TV license, and the reason it's a separate thing is because it uses a separate rate based upon the cable subscription price. And the same thing could be said for streaming TV. We're kind of entering this new era where, you have Hulu and Netflix and things like that use these really super complex formulas to generate what license royalties look like. So they're not a flat rate. Same thing with cable. It's not a flat rate. It's based upon a lot of different factors, and each cable company and cable provider and each cable channel has a different rate on how they pay the use for those licenses. Those licenses are also cable TV. Essentially, licenses are pre-approved because the artist always knows they're going to television versus in some of these other formats where they might not be approved until after the use of it. They're definitely pre-approved. And that kind of takes us to the last one, sync, which sync licenses are always pre-approved, but they also come with a fun fee at the front end. So an artist with a sync license could get paid $20,000 from the sync, and depending on where they're synced to and what it's synced to, they can also make the percentages on the back end. Super important part about this that I know somewhere exists on the final exam, and it's a question about if I have a sync license and my music is put on a film that goes to theaters, do I also receive a performance royalty from the PRO? And the answer is no, because the PROs only pay for television, live performance and live performance venues, radio, streaming, and internet radio. They unfortunately do not pay royalties for use in theaters. But once that movie goes to television and hits TV, all of a sudden there's a PRO, royalty generated, because once it's on TV, it falls under the performance category, which kind of puts us in a position where, like, if you knew you're going to get paid a sync license and it's going to be $20,000, if you had to choose, if you had two offerings, one was a TV show for $20,000 and the other was a film for $20,000, you kind of have to look at two things. When you go direct to TV, obviously you're going to make the PRO value, but it just matters. It does matter what the TV show is, and it does matter what the movie is. So it's like if I was going to have a song in a blockbuster film, I'd rather have that all day because I know the broadcasting engine of who's going to see it from an audience standpoint is so much larger than if I signed on for some sitcom that might not do well past its pilot episode. So that's kind of one of those things that can be considered too. That's it. I know it's long. There's a ton of stuff. If you're unsure, just email me, message me. You can find me at james.casas@unlv.edu. But you can also check some of the slides, any of the previous videos. There's lots of stuff to be talked about and definitely lots of information for you to just make sure you have a handle on. So good luck.